wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the nature of conjugal unions.
Yeah.
If I understood you correctly, men receive, that is, they're the beneficiaries of investment by their female partners.
What do men give?
Right. I mean, what are the women getting out of the relationship?
That's a very good question. So, what do women get out of the relationship? They get security and support. So if anything were to go wrong, and because Jamaica is such an unsafe space, and it just is, I knew lots of women who would call on ex-boyfriends or their current boyfriend if they were, had car trouble on an abandoned road somewhere, if their house had gotten broken into, if their child was sick and they had no ride, they would call on these boyfriends for this help. They would call on boyfriends for small financial support. But it didn't seem to me that it was particularly consistent or reliable, so that women were maintaining, as was pointed out in the one article by Horston Miller, these long lists of ex-boyfriends, because it didn't seem to me, unless it was a short-term new relationship where folks are kind of really into each other, for the most part, those pathways were not reliable. So sometimes you could count on one guy, and sometimes you could count on a different guy, and you had to kind of feel it out to pull together all the resources you needed in order to kind of get through the day or get through the week.
So part of what they're getting is physical protection. Right?
Yeah, physical, I would say more support. So it's protection, but it's not as if they kind of have a guy who's like helping them out every time someone is kind of intimidating them. But if something bad happened, they're typically, that had to do with kind of violence or risk, there was a male partner would be supportive in that moment. So both are getting things out of it, but men seem to have a wider and more diverse resource pathways, more people that they could call upon, and it was more socially accepted for them to do that.
To follow up this question, you're saying that folks are not really want to talk about the conjugal union if they have a long-term partner and they have extra pair partners.
Yeah.
Then there seems to be a high social cost to be found that they have no relationship besides their marriage, and I'm not sure how much is the cost and versus the social support they can get.
Right. So there's a huge cost for women to have extra pair relationships. There's not a huge cost for men. Men didn't want it said because, from my perspective, men didn't want it said because it doesn't look good. It's not a great thing to say that you have lots of women. The younger guys didn't care as much, but once guys were kind of in their late 20s to 30s, it wasn't the best thing. But men, I asked several women this question. Once I started asking men this question, and all the men were answering in the same way, I asked the women, I said, just generally speaking, if your husband or your partner has another woman, do you break up with him? Because this is my framework, that it's over. And they were like, no, well, you don't know if that's going to last. That could just be a fling. That could just end, and we have history, or we have kids together, or I really care about him. But for the men, it was very unacceptable for women to have another partner. And so the costs are not equal for men and women. And a lot of the men I knew, for example, I would see them during the day with their girlfriends, and I knew all their girlfriends, and then I would see them at night with their second girlfriend. And I would, and it was expected that I would never say anything about this. Even though both of those women ended up being my friends after a year and a half there, it was not appropriate for me to make any insinuation. But for women, I didn't know very many women at all who had more than one man.
So with respect to the effect of orphanage, do you have any data that can differentiate between it being kind of institutional differences between the orphanages versus some sort of self-selection into different, what is the process by which the kids get to the different orphanages?
That's a very, very good question. So we asked the caretakers that, how did the kids end up here? And basically what happens is that in most cases, the state, the government of Jamaica is brought in because the child care situation isn't good, and the state decides which home they go to. And so there were a few cases, but from my perspective, from the interviews with the caretakers, maybe 10 to 15% of cases where parents brought their own kids in and said, I can't take care of them anymore. But for the most part, a social worker got a case and said, who has an open bed? And that child got sent to that orphanage. So that's one problem. The other real limitation to this is that I can't find out why the kids are there. It's very sensitive information. It was made very clear to me that if I wanted to get Ministry of Health approval on this project, that it absolutely could not be included that I find out why each individual kid is there. And so that's very challenging because you don't, in terms of looking at health differences, you don't know what situation brought them there, what conditions they were in before they got there, and kind of whether the orphanage is kind of having them doing a little bit better or they're doing a little bit worse. One child, a caretaker told me just in passing that one child had seen his father rape and murder several people. You know, so for some, but then there was another family where they were extremely close family and just did not have the money. And she said the parents would come and visit all of the time. And so there's quite a bit of variability in terms of why kids end up there, and it's not entirely clear if there's a more patterned way that the kids end up in each individual home.
I was kind of confused at how you were using the BMI data, since you were considering high BMI to be negative.
Yes.
But did you have any children that were undernourished, or did you
No.
consider any? Oh, you had none.
So that's the thing. So one thing I need to look at, so I'm looking at BMI together, but I think one thing that I will find in terms of undernourishment is stunting. And so once I pull out height and look at height separately and Z-score height, I think I will see variability with regards to height. But then again, BMI brings those two together and also Z-scores it. This is why I had to rethink my ideas about the orphanage being bad, because what I was expecting to see was a bunch of kids who were completely undernourished. And I don't have that, actually.
And in the adult population, you just don't see
No.
anyone undernourished.
No. So Jamaica is going through the nutrition transition just as, you know, the rest of the world. And so what you're starting to see, you know, 30 years ago, data on Jamaica, you did have lots of malnourished adults, folks who were really struggling socioeconomically. Now, those same folks who are struggling socioeconomically are heavier rather than malnourished. And so I've had to rethink that as well. Initially, when I went in, I thought I would see all kinds of patterns of undernourishment, and you see patterns of overnourishment.
So your results, your linear model really does fit what you're seeing.
Yeah.
There is not a hidden curvilinear.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
At what age do children usually enter orphanages?
That was a good question, because I asked several caretakers that, you know, so what's the average age of the child who enters here? And folks didn't, they were just like, well, we get kids at every age. This is what everyone told me. We get kids at every age. And so looking at my own data, the problem is because I can't ask kind of what got them there. We do know we have this prevalence of kids who are around 9, 10 years old. And so I don't know, all of them have not been there their whole lives. So all the kids do not come in as babies. And in fact, each of these orphanages has a space that they call Babyland. And it's the place where they house little babies and toddlers. And Babyland, which I was expecting to be kind of big and have tons and tons of kids, was typically very small. You typically only had about, I think, in this study, out of all the kids, I probably only have about 10 infants or 7 infants. But I have a ton of kids who are about 7 to, say, 12 years old. And so my guess, without more information, my guess is that folks are making a go of it. And then something happens, either some tragedy, crime, or just poverty that leads the kids there once they've, you know, been in their family homes. Because most of these kids, you know, one kind of really devastating part of this study is I would ask, you know, so who helps you out with money and, you know, that kind of question. And some kids would say mom and dad. And I would ask a caretaker later, some of the kids, and I, you know, couldn't use the kids by name, but I would say, you know, some of the kids said mom and dad. Did they see their mom? Oh, they haven't seen their mom. And none of these kids have seen their moms and dads in 6 years. And so there's a memory of home. And it's clear to me that most of the kids had lived in some kind of biological family home for some part in their life, except for the little infants.
What is the history of the population in Jamaica? Not, for example, people are bought as slaves, right?
Yes.
How many descend from Native Americans?
Very few, very few. So the Taino Indians or the Arawak Indians, which were the Native Americans who were, well, Native Caribbeans who were there before really colonialism really got into full boom, were basically decimated for the most part. And so there's not, and in fact, I have a friend who recently did a project on Native identity politics in Puerto Rico, because there's a discussion of Indianness in Puerto Rico, even if there isn't a vibrant population of individuals who are still alive there, who were indigenous folks there. And so the same thing kind of is in Jamaica. We don't have the same politics of it, but the population was pretty much decimated. And so who repopulated the island were mostly African slaves and a small percentage of white British Isle colonial folks.
And this population is completely mixed now?
So it's very interesting. Oh, and I should say also, very huge Chinese population in Jamaica, notable Syrian population in Jamaica, notable Indian population in Jamaica, Indian from India. And so there is quite a bit of admixture, but Jamaica's political identities about self is very much, their motto is, I think, one flag, one people, or one land, one people, something like that. And so it's very hard to get folks to talk about ethnicity. Folks don't really talk about ethnicity as much. And in fact, a lot of Chinese Jamaicans that I spoke to in Jamaica, if you talk to them about ethnicity, they say, I'm Jamaican. I'm Jamaican. And so kind of thinking about admixture, thinking about kind of ethnic differences is it's kind of a different ideology around identity politics than it is here in the US.
So I'm trying to reconcile a couple of things that you said, and I mean, one possibility is theories are just wrong and you got to start over again. But so men benefit from their conjugal unions in terms of flow of resources as well as reproductive opportunities. And if we want to be maybe generous, we say, well, there's a bilateral flow of resources, right? Because you pointed out that men provide to their various partners.
Right.
In describing that, you noted that they are not necessarily particular about the paternity of the children that benefit from those resources, so that they'll provide to a partner, and maybe some of those children that benefit are theirs, and maybe some of them are not.
Yeah.
And then you told us that there's this clear double standard about promiscuity.
Yeah.
I mean, we might expect that men would not be particularly proprietary if they have little investment in them.
Right.
That is, if they don't have much at stake, then paternity certainly shouldn't matter much to them. So why do they care?
So it's very interesting. There is actually an expression in Jamaica so how can I explain this? When a man takes care of a child that's not his own, when the whole community knows that the child is not his own, but he doesn't want to accept it. It's not like he knows, but it's just like, he's like, no, that's my child. And everyone's winking and nudging behind his back. They call it a jacket. They say he's wearing a jacket. Or they don't say he's wearing a jacket. They say, oh, that's a jacket. And I was like, and I remember asking, what does that mean? And they were like, it's a cover-up. Like, it's a cover-up that's not his child. And so what do men get out of it? I think they get increased reproductive opportunities with that woman. So if they're caring for that child, even though the child, or maybe not caring, like caring is, we're not talking about picking up the baby and taking it to daycare and always changing diapers. We're talking about, I'll bring by a pack of diapers and that'll help you out now and then. I think that they get access to that woman, that they've built an investment interaction with each other that then is an avenue of reproductive opportunities for the future. So I think that's what they get out of it, even if it's at a evolutionary cost to themselves, one that we would not necessarily predict in terms of an investment in a non-biological child.
Thanks for coming. You said that there was a difference in age.
Yeah.
In the willingness to admit
Yeah.
the having extra care.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if that might be due to a norm about taking care of children that you already have. Is that what that's about?
I think it's about taking care of kids, but it's also about kind of proper behavior. And so in Jamaican culture, there's this discussion of rude boys and gangsters and that kind of thing. And it's just like it is here, more socially acceptable for younger guys to kind of be out and about and going out dancing and they always talk about living a sporting life, you know, and doing all of these things. And that includes, I think, extra pair relationships. But I think as men get older, there is a kind of cultural practice, not necessarily of not having other women, but of being more mature in the way that you deal with it, or more respectful in the way that you talk about it, so that all of the older guys I knew also had other women, but they did not flaunt it in the same way that some of the younger guys did. It was a kind of reckless, I considered it to be a kind of reckless youth kind of cultural discussions about what is acceptable for young men versus men who were a little bit older.
So when you look at those models of BMI
Yeah.
and marital or relationships,
Mhm.
do you control for age in
Yes.
those models?
Yeah.
Okay, so those are effects independent of age.
Yeah, I control for age, I control for socioeconomic status. Yeah.
In poor societies, one reason people invest in children is late life insurance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can you
Talk about that.
you see this?
Yes, yes.
That's why the man.
Yeah. So it's, yes, well, it's very interesting. So I remember speaking to several women who were childbearing age who hadn't had kids yet. And by the way, that was me when I was doing my research, even though I was only about 25 at the time. Folks were looking at me like I was absolutely insane that I did not have kids yet. And I had several older women asked me if I would have problems having children, if that's why I did not have kids yet, because they couldn't understand why I didn't have kids yet. And the discussion is that you should always have more than one, because if something happens to one, then who's going to take care of you when you get older? And so there is a lot of discussion about the value that kids bring to your life, particularly as you get older. And there is the expectation culturally that people care for their older parents late in life. And so even some parents who were in homes, which I knew very few of, the children, the adult children, brought their parents food almost every single day. And so the homes that their parents were in Mandeville. And the kids were doing, the adult children were doing a lot of caretaking, even though the parents were in homes. And most of the adults that I knew who had older adult parents, those parents lived in the home with them. And so there is a discussion of having kids so that you won't be alone, so that you'll have someone to help you.
Can you give me part of the answer there about the man? Are they getting the help in older age?
I mean, maybe. There's also just a. I think it's part of it, but I do think that men get a certain amount of social capital for both having lots of partners, but also being a reliable guy. So that there's a reason why they are bringing diapers by or giving up phone cards or little bits of money here and there. Because I do think it earns them kind of both social cachet and sexual cachet with both women and other people in the community.
Just went over my head, but is there like a conclusion or a take-home message to your research or your presentation?
Yeah, so I think the take-home message is that, that when we think about evolutionary theory broadly speaking, right, and we think about things like kin investment theory, or we think about things like reciprocal altruism, that unless you contextualize them, that you're going to miss the most important patterns, right? That you're going to miss the most important factors that actually are influencing these patterns. And so we could think broadly about something like resource availability, right? But what does resource availability mean on the ground for people who are in kind of sexual relationships of variable duration, or kids who are living in homes that are, not their biological homes? How do we re-articulate these classic evolutionary theories in empirical studies of modern living populations?
So you chose the 4-year duration of the conjugal unions as a break point. And I mean, I could see that there was a change in consequences then, but I was curious whether you had any a priori reason for choosing 4 years.
Well-
and just if I could finish this
Oh, yeah,
relatedly,
sorry.
What's the typical interbirth interval for women?
That's a really good question. So my reasoning for choosing a 4-year break was that we actually saw when you started to look at like the mean length of time of duration, it was a little bit over 4 years. Not mean. When you started to look at the long-term relationships, so it started at about 4 years. When people were together 4 years or more, they ended up being together for quite a long time. And so it seemed like a reasonable break for identifying relationships that were going to go into the future. Whereas the shorter relationships, you saw things kind of end around 3 years, and you would talk to people about, well, what about, because I also asked them what about the relationship before this, you know, so I could kind of get an idea of what they were doing over the course of their adulthood. An interbirth interval, extremely variable, and I actually don't have finite data on that. But I do know that there were several families that I knew where there were kids who were 2 to say 4 years apart. But then there were several families that I knew where kids were 20 years apart, 15 years apart, where there was a child that had, say, 18, 19 years old. A woman would have her first child and maybe have another child 2 years later, and then there would be a long break. And there would be another child at right around 40 years old. And in fact, one of the women that I met this recent trip, we thought, me and my research assistant, we thought the whole trip that this child that she had, who was 6 years old, was her only child. She later told me she has a 30-year-old daughter, who was her older daughter, and this was a new relationship, and she had another child. And so it's quite variable, but it does map onto these relationships that are, you know, so I did find that a lot of women had multiple, and the term baby father is a term in Jamaica that's used all the time, that women had multiple baby fathers, and they mapped onto these short-term or 3 to 4 year relationships. You're in a relationship, you have a child, it ends, you have another child with the next guy.
In these relationships, as you mentioned as sort of your sample, this is what a household could look like the mother, the cousin's boyfriend, or so they are. How often are they actually co-resident during the relationship versus? It was my understanding was we were framing it as sort of a visiting relationship.
Yes.
They weren't co-resident.
Yes. Very few relationships that I studied were co-residents. So small that it wasn't a viable group for me to do kind of, statistical analysis on out of all the people that I interviewed. Most of the reason I think that happens is financial logistics. It was very difficult for new couples to get an apartment together. You would have a boyfriend or a new not most of the time when folks actually had the money to get married, they would actually have the money to get a house together as well. But it was very rare. And so in these relationships, these short-term relationships or new relationships, it was often the case that a new boyfriend is living with his family and you're living with your family, and you guys would be together. And that meant even if a baby came out of that relationship, that the finances of getting a place together, I didn't know, almost no one that I knew had their own apartment. Move in together.
He moved in with her family or something.
No, very rare.
And so you have 40-year-old men living with their mothers, basically?
Well, you have 40, by the time guys are about 40 years old, they're often living by themselves. I had a lot of older guys in my, if they had never gotten formally married, they lived by themselves, and they had several partners. And so they would go over to this one's house or that one's house for dinner, spend a few nights, that kind of thing. But the men that I knew who did not live with extended family, and they were in their, say, 40s, lived by themselves.
I just wondered, if there's so much sort of underground kind of promiscuity going on in these conjugal unions amongst adults, then you'd imagine that sort of disease transmission rates would be relatively high amongst adult relations. So then that should translate into an effect upon children. So because the children would have AIDS, or the children would have diseases which could dominate the effect of the children's health compared to just being an orphan.
Right.
Is there a way to sort of You know, are children, like, you know, are some of these orphanages, do they have children who are like, you know, babies
Yes,
or that?
yes.
Or like,
Yeah, so not the ones that I visited, because I think the way that Manchester Parish is more financially secure than other parts of the island. The homes that I visited, I was actually not allowed into one home. And I remember the woman, and this was very interesting to me, the woman was American, actually, who ran the home. And so I was thinking, because I was speaking earlier about to one of the students about how Jamaica is not the easiest place to do ethnographic research because folks are not particularly trusting, particularly of Americans. And so it's been a challenge to do some research there, and that's why it's taken many, many years to develop research projects there. But one woman, this was an American woman, I remember hearing her voice, and I was like, oh, she's American, I can explain my project, she knows, you know, she understands our educational system, she knows what I do for a living, like this will be a little bit easier, I can get into the home. And she just was like, no. Like she wouldn't let me come do my spiel, present the paper, like none of it, you know, she was just not interested. And when I spoke to another caretaker of another home later on, and she said, so are you having good success? And I said, in some of the homes, I said, one home wouldn't let me in. And she guessed which home it was. And she said that they were under investigation because they had a child there who was HIV positive and they never reported it. And they weren't getting the child the care, the proper antiretroviral drugs and things that the child needed. And so there was some questions about, because the state does give them some money. These are private homes, but the state does contribute to their welfare, so that maybe she didn't want to report this because she would lose a child. There is a home in Kingston that is completely for, I think it's called Mustard Seed Children's Home, and it is completely for children who are HIV positive. And so Jamaica has had a real problem with HIV over the years, and there is an impact on children's health. And of course, because this is the way it always works, these are parents who are most vulnerable, and so the kids are increasingly vulnerable because they don't have stable, healthy parents.
Is there any state foster care system analogous to ours, or is it to all the kids that they go to the homes? So it's interesting. There are both private and state-run homes. In the parish that I work in, they're all private. And I did not know that until later on. The ones that are the state-run are in Kingston, mostly in Kingston, and the conditions in them are not very good at all. And the way that it works typically is that the kids are, the state is called in. The kids are placed in these homes. That's their first step, is they're removed from their homes. They're placed into one of these homes. And then after that, a fostering situation can come about. There are people kind of on the books who will foster some of these kids. And so the social workers will come in and say, ask the people on the books, will you be willing to take a child? And so it's interesting. The homes are, the state gives them a little bit of money, but it's not very much. Yeah.
One of the comparisons you were making was with like the Eastern European orphanage system, and you mentioned that you see a contrast with that situation. Do you think that there are some differences in the way that care is allocated, or if they have kind of outside roles, maybe not, you said not parents, but maybe other kin relations that are still in their lives?
Yeah, so I am fascinated as to why there is this difference, because as I mentioned, I assumed that these kids would be struggling because they were in orphanages, and I knew this was like the thing that people don't talk about in Jamaica. And in fact, I'd spoken to Jamaicans, they didn't know there were orphanages, right? I think that there is I don't know this for a fact. I'm wondering, I should say, if there is different stigma around orphanages and orphans in different parts of the world, so that, whether people want to extend themselves and because what I saw at these children's homes was that folks who were just in the community would come and take a kid for the weekend. You could do a home visit with a child. And there were folks who said, oh, I do home visits every now and then, and I go pick up a kid and I take them home with me for the weekend. So there was this idea amongst the caretakers and amongst folks in the community who did know about the orphanages that we need to really invest in these vulnerable kids. I'm not sure at all, really, of the context that leads kids to the orphanages in Eastern Europe. And so, what leads them there? Does anyone come for them, or is there a kind of break-off point? Because for a lot of these kids in these children's homes, if their parents had the means, the parents would come visit them. It wasn't a closed network in the same way that it is in a lot of places. And this is interesting because these are kids, you know, except for in the case of that poor kid who had been traumatized by his dad's crimes, for a lot of these kids, their parents just couldn't make it. Maybe they had drug problems, maybe they were just poor, you know, lots of different things. But unless they were like in jail, a lot of the parents tried to come and visit. A lot of extended family members tried to come and visit. And so a lot of the several caretakers told us that, you know, they get visitors from their family. And they know that their family can't take them, but they still come and visit them. Yes. Yes.
It's very interesting to know kids who thought that their parents were there for them, at least trying, meant to, as opposed to kids who had no contact. Really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's part of the reason why I really wanted to get the cortisol levels for these kids, because I think there would be a kind of really more nuanced expression of how they're coping and how and their own ideas about their self. Some of the kids had siblings in the homes with them and some didn't. And so that's like another kind of interesting factor. And some of the kids had siblings in other homes. You know, so they didn't get placed in the same home as their sibling, and that's a kind of state policy about placement.
Everybody has a cell phone. Do you know how much of their income is going into this and why it's so important for them?
I don't know how much of their income is going to. I didn't talk about it in this talk, but I had to come up with a pretty intricate measurement of socioeconomic status for this population because no one could tell me what they made in a year. You know, there's the idea of like, you know, tax returns where you can kind of tell someone what, you know, no one could tell me that. And so what I ended up doing is what you see in a lot of studies where you see folks kind of figure out what appliances folks have and whether they have cars and, you know, and I also added in a figure for who they could rely on for money because that ended up being really important and it ended up actually being like income, just like remittances are income for families. As far as I can see, you know, very few people, now everyone, I mean, not now everyone, but several people are getting smartphones now even. And so smartphones are kind of making their way through the community at rapid pace. But outside of smartphones, very few people had access to the internet. You know, there were internet cafes, but I knew almost no one who had a computer in their home or who had internet access in their home. Only very wealthy people did. And so it's clear to me that cell phones are the way of communicating with everyone. And text messaging is a lot cheaper than calling people. And so, and most of these people have prepaid cell phones. And so they're, you know, buying 200 Jamaican, you know, dollars worth of credit. And almost all interactions about who's picking kids up from daycare, what we're going to get from the supermarket, all of this is done through brief text messaging all day. And so for me, it became very clear that cell phones were the major way of communicating when things like electrical lines and landline phone lines are extremely expensive, and computers are inaccessible for a lot of folks.
Okay, I think we're just about out of time.
Okay.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you.